Well, I asked somebody to check, but so.
Make that transparent.
Talking about the light up here? Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, people of a certain age are not going to be able to read their notes.
Okay, I think we're ready to start with the afternoon, so we can get finished at least before dinner. Well, so this session is a session on ICT consolidation, business imperatives, and policy responses. And if you're reading the financial press or even the general press these days, you know, you see loads of articles about a forthcoming merger, a wave of mergers in the tech, media, and communication space. Lots of articles about specific mergers, either rumored or actual. Speaking for myself, it's not always clear to me what's going on. So I'm looking very much forward to this panel of very bright people to clear up all the confusions, and I'm hoping that in an hour everything will be crystal clear. But there's lots of questions. I mean, for the first basic question is: are we in fact seeing a wave of mergers, or will we see a wave of mergers that is out of the ordinary in these industries? What are the economic motivations, and what, if any, are the policy implications? As I indicated, we have a very distinguished panel, a group of panelists to help us understand what's going on. I'm going to start by asking a question to each of the panelists and ask them to talk for 3 or 4 minutes and kind of make the most important point they think that they have to make. And I'm going to start off with Michael Katz. Michael is probably well known to all of you. Michael is the Sarin Chair in Strategy and Leadership and Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics and the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also a former chief economist, both of the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, as well as the Federal Communications Commission. And he's going to start us off by kind of talking at a high level about what sort of factors one would want to look at in trying to understand whether various mergers, both vertical and horizontal, in these industries make sense. Michael?
Okay. In fact, I'm going to, I think, step back even further than that, and I'll talk more on the policy side than the business imperative side. Because I think going forward, a lot of the issues, while they may be couched in some of the language we apply to mergers, I think a lot of the issues are going to be played out not in the, necessarily in the merger context. So maybe I'll do, as I said, start by just laying out what I see are the sorts of concerns people have when they start talking about consolidation, and the fact that I think they mean something often different than consolidation and a broader thing. So you could think of sort of the most traditional concern people have as saying, we're talking about particularly with mergers, but the rise of concentration in specific markets. Okay, and so, you know, traditional horizontal merger of two firms that are direct competitors, and I think almost certainly we will see some of those come up in the next year or two in the ICT space, but it's really something we've seen a lot and we're used to, and the only thing I would say there is I think there's a lot of concern, though, not just with mergers, but people are becoming concerned with concentration, period. You know, we hear all these things about winner-take-all markets, and I think we're going to see some interesting developments where people are going to be concerned about concentration, whether it's due to merger or whether it's just due to the competitive dynamics, and that certain firms have prevailed organically and ended up being the dominant firms in their market. The US and European approaches to dominance are very different, but I can see there being pressure, certainly in the US, with populist movements on both the left and the right, to start addressing those and thinking about them in different ways. The second thing, and again, this is one we've seen a bunch, is I think of as geographic consolidation, where the firms are at the product market level are in the same markets, but they're in different geographic markets. And we've certainly seen concerns with those as well, where you're seeing something like, say, Comcast and Time Warner Cable, even though they weren't direct competitors, people still raised competitive concerns, or what they can perceive to be competitive concerns. So let me keep working on the next level, though, and that is, and this is one I think we're going to see a lot of going forward, is the whole question of vertical integration. And so it's not that the firms were competitors with one another, but that we're talking about either mergers or organic growth going into different related markets. And clearly there the concerns, historically, if there is a competitive concern, it's that the vertical control is going to give rise to some sort of foreclosure. My experience when I was at the Department of Justice a lot of years ago was that whenever a vertical merger came up, at least among the economists, we could identify a lot of reasons why it could be problematical and all sorts of theories. And then inevitably, when we looked at the facts, we concluded that it really wasn't a problem. But I think we're seeing increasing concerns about vertical mergers, and we're going to see increasing policy pressure brought to bear on them. And also, I think this is one where we're going to see, well, actually, let me do the fourth one, then I'll come back to do the two things. I think we're also seeing a fourth kind of concern, and that is in some ways a return to the views of antitrust in the US in the 1960s, which is just concern with size, and not necessarily concentration in a given market. But there is this concern in some circles, and it's actually not one I generally share, but that we have companies that are just getting too big and they're in too many things. And those start merging together, and thinking particularly, right, of people's views now of whatever, the big 5 or 4 or 6, depending on what you think of Microsoft and Netflix, I suppose. But certainly, you know, with Amazon, Facebook, and Google, people wondering, are they too big and in too many markets? And some of that starts going back into, well, can they engage in foreclosure because of those effects? But I also think we're seeing now developing, in this sense, going back more like 80 years, I guess, in antitrust, concerns about, well, okay, it's not just about what's going on in a particular market and pricing there, but it's also about political power. It's also potentially about a lack of a diverse pool of innovators. So anyway, as I say, I see the sets of issues that are coming up with expanding and going far beyond what I think traditionally is where we focus, which has really been on horizontal mergers and concentration in specific markets. And on this question, I think this big one of vertical, there's really two questions, right? One is, and this is from the business side too, is what set of activities should a firm engage in? You know, when do we need to have one firm doing everything? When can we do it arm's length? And I think the answer is nobody knows. And the answer also is that we go in these cycles, right? we've had at various points, everybody, the computer industry went through this. There's the whole thing of IBM, it's way more efficient, they should do everything end to end. Then there was all the set of companies that said, IBM, they're a bunch of idiots. Everybody knows you really need to disintegrate the industry, and that's why Intel should be separate from Microsoft, should be separate from some other companies. And now we see a lot of companies going back to, well, look, we need to do everything. And if you look, from my understanding of companies like Facebook and Google, right, they get into chip design for the chips that they're using and stuff in their servers. I mean, they're really going to hugely integrated models again. So one issue is, what activities do you really need to be in? And it's extremely hard to know because you can innovate in terms of what can be done arm's length, so it could change over time. And then the second thing is, well, do you need a merger to do it, or can you do it through organic growth? And I actually, at this point, I'll shut up for a few minutes, is to say, I think we're going to see both of those being controversial in the case of these really large firms. Certainly with mergers, they're going to get scrutiny like they always have, and maybe more. But you're also going to see this, I think, even with organic growth, and we already have seen this, right? The claims, for example, that when Google goes into, well, you have to debate actually whether it's a new product or say it's an extension of search, but new activities, whether it's the fact that it gets certain advantages from the other activities in which it engages, whether those are violations of competition policy or not. So I think we're going to just increasingly see firms come under scrutiny every time they want to do something new, keep asking this question, well, are they able to do it because they have some sort of unfair or uncompetitive advantage that allows them to dominate? And then actually the last word I'll have is that in thinking about all these things and should the activities go together, it's really a question about complementary assets that it's somehow difficult to trade at arm's length. And I think a really critical one there, and we've heard about it already today, are these whole issues of data, right? So if you look in the content industry, you certainly hear a lot of content providers saying they need to have a direct customer relationship. They need to at least be integrated in, and there are different notions of what that is, and whether it's physical distribution or you're an aggregator, but they feel they need to be integrated in that because content creation has to be tied with something that gives you access to direct access to data about customers. And so I think we're going to, the final thing I'm saying on that is that we're going to see increasingly that when people think about what these complementary assets are, often it's really going to be about various forms of information, both intellectual property, but also ever increasingly data. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Well, those are a lot of ideas that hopefully we'll get a chance to return to in the general discussion. Our next speaker is Bob Crandall, who is an adjunct senior fellow at TPI. I think he's going to talk to us about consolidation in the video and cable sectors and about some of the recent trends in consolidation.
Thanks, Tom. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, when Tom first contacted us about discussing consolidation in IT because of all these stories he was reading, my reaction was, what consolidation? There hasn't been much yet, but there's a lot of rumored consolidation. If you go through the sectors, fixed wire telecom, obviously there's been deconsolidation there as Verizon has spun off a lot of its operations to small struggling carriers who continue to struggle with these assets. Wireless, there has been no particular consolidation in a considerable number of years, though there's one participant in that industry, namely Sprint, Mr. Son of SoftBank, who would like to consolidate, apparently. There's a rumor every other day about whom he'd like to merge with, but there has not been much consolidation there. We can discuss at some point whether the agreement between Charter and Verizon is pro-competitive, anti-competitive, or is slowing down potential competitive entry into wireless or not. In cable satellite, there has been some consolidation, obviously. Charter and Time Warner Cable merged. AT&T and DirecTV merged. The first of those clearly didn't increase concentration. You could argue that the second did to a small extent. And then Altice, a big player in Europe, has been buying up companies around the globe, including Cablevision here and Suddenlink, and now is rumored to be interested in Charter, which I doubt will happen, but we'll have to see. But my concern mostly today in my discussion today will be mostly about traditional media and cable distribution and the horizontal and vertical issues there. Michael addressed the difference between horizontal and vertical problems. It's interesting in the traditional video media area, to go back way back in history to 1948 when the motion picture companies were broken up. That is, their exhibition chains were split off from the distribution chains, with the theory being it was going to increase competition in motion picture distribution. Thereafter, shortly thereafter, television networks got going, television got going, and actually it was a boon to the motion picture companies to be forced to get rid of their theaters because they went down in value substantially in a few years after that. And then the growth of the problem, the concern of regulators in Washington, both at the FCC and the Antitrust Division, was the growing market dominance of television networks. And there were all sorts of proceedings initiated, sometimes at competitors' recommendations, not a surprise at Washington, to investigate the activities of the television networks and the way they procured programs, and the way they kept rights in those programs. And there were all kinds of regulations and limiting how much they could invest in such programming, what residual rights they could keep, and even how much programming they could have during primetime hours. And there was a primetime access rule which limited the number of hours in which they could broadcast, a rule which made Merv Griffin a multi-billionaire as he developed all those silly game shows. But the interesting thing is, as this played out, most everyone agreed that these initiatives, particularly the Antitrust Division's charge that each network monopolized its primetime schedule, and that was a separate market from ABC, was a separate market from CBS, from NBC. Fortunately, they didn't go to trial with that theory. I don't think they could have won. But at the end of the day, what finally happened? Well, what happened was that all the television networks were either acquired by or combined with the motion picture companies who'd been their adversaries for years. You know, Disney owns ABC, Fox, 20th Century Fox, 21st Century Fox now owns Fox, CBS, Viacom, Paramount, and so forth, NBC Universal. So the motion picture companies and the television networks eventually combined. And interestingly enough, if you now look at the data, in 1948, the seven of the eight biggest motion picture companies controlled 76% of all motion picture revenues. I exclude RKO there because RKO essentially committed suicide about this time by joining the McCarthy crusade and went downhill very rapidly. So the top seven controlled 76%. Today, in the most recent data that I have, 1975, 1976, the seven leading traditional video companies, Disney, Time Warner, Viacom, CBS, Sony, et cetera, the seven leading companies control 73%, or at least the sum of their revenues is 73% of what BEA and the Department of Commerce reports as gross national income originating in motion picture production and distribution and cable network programming. So the concentration is almost exactly the same. So the years of activity at in Washington either didn't have any effect or they prevented further concentration. But now you certainly wouldn't worry about concentration, horizontal concentration in traditional media industries, given that you no longer have to have a distribution system to offer video programming. You can be a Netflix and just simply go on the internet and provide it. And so Amazon Media, Netflix, and a lot of other companies, including some of the traditional companies, now with Disney saying it's no longer going to supply all of its products to cable and is going to stream them themselves, the entry barriers have diminished substantially, and you surely wouldn't worry much about horizontal concentration. But how about vertical? Well, that was always a concern, and Michael raises the issue of whether the distributor owning the content might foreclose competition by denying that content to their competitors. Well, we have one big example of that and one potential example. NBC Universal was acquired by Comcast about 8-9 years ago, and they acquired control, and then they acquired the rest of it subsequently. And right now, of course, AT&T is trying to buy Time Warner. Should we fear this? Is there a reason for concern? Well, if you look at the numbers, I can see no evidence that the acquisition of NBC Universal helped Comcast in any material way. I mean, they may be making a return like the returns that Time Warner and Viacom and the others are making on their media assets, but it doesn't seem to have affected their stock price. Their stock price for a long time was not growing as rapidly as some of the others. Today, it's impossible to make much of a comparison because the number of independent cable companies that you can compare them with has diminished substantially. Charter stock has gone out of sight. But you'd have to then ask, well, what effect, why should we be concerned about AT&T acquiring Time Warner? If you look at what's happened recently to the large media stocks, they've leveled off and even declined in the last couple of years because of the concern of what streaming is going to do to their marketplace. The one company that seems to me to have declined the least, sort of flattened out but didn't decline, is Time Warner. Now, I think that might be because there's an implicit put option there. That is, AT&T provided a very nice price in buying them, which would suggest, again, that maybe AT&T may have overpaid for Time Warner, and I don't know if the deal's going to close or not. But I see no evidence anywhere that there is a potential vertical foreclosure problem with a cable company owning a large content company. And finally, if you really want the answer to this, we should have had John Malone from Denver come up here and talk to us, because John Malone has huge interests in the cable business around the world. Through his Liberty Global, he's acquired control of an enormous number of cable systems in Europe. He's now a principal architect behind the growth of Charter and has big interests in Charter. He also has huge interests in media companies. Let's see if I can find them here. He's got Discovery, Lionsgate, QVC. Of course, there's a pending merger with SNI, Sirius, Liberty Interactive, and even Formula One and the Atlanta Braves. But he keeps these things separate from the cable operations. If you look around the world, there are very few cable companies, or any cable companies I could find outside of the United States, who are acquiring media properties. And John Malone, who I think knows this business pretty well, has decided to keep his media companies separate from his cable distribution companies.
Thanks, Bob. Well, not to cast any aspersions on my fellow economists, our next speaker actually deals with the real world, or at least real people's money. Laura Martin is the senior analyst for entertainment, cable, and media at Needham and Company. Laura, ultimately, the consumer is obviously paramount in all of this, and consumers face a rapidly increasing array of choices, which presumably is a good thing. So the question is, how does all of that affect trends in consolidation and incentives to consolidate?
Okay, so I'm going to set my timer for 3 minutes and then stop talking. Dina did slides because she's really organized. I'm going to do three-dimensional slides. And this goes back to Michael's point. This is Apple's market cap, $800 billion. And the market trades $500 billion a year, and it bets on the future. It bets on future earning streams. And if you're bad at this, people take their money away from you and they give it to a passive index, or they give it to an active money manager that beats the passive index. So Apple is hitting all-time highs at $800 billion of market cap. Google, 630 today. Microsoft, 550. Facebook, 480. Amazon, Alibaba, round numbers, $450 billion of market cap. I am now going to go to all of them built, not bought. All of them built by a guy, usually a guy or two guys. I'm now going to sit down and go to the traditional world, which is what this panel is sort of talking about, which I think is looking backwards, not forwards. AT&T and Comcast, 200 million here. Not here. This is half the size of the companies have been built in the last 15 years. 200 billion for AT&T and Comcast. Charter, 100 billion. Disney, 160. Time Warner, 90, because it's being taken over. You want to get to Discovery and Scripps, 11 billion each. So when we're talking about acquisitions of DirecTV trying to buy Time Warner, together they'll be 310 billion, still 25% below Amazon, which is the lowest of the new companies. So it is my view that these companies must merge to play in the basis of competition, which is the new world, which is huge scale, globally distributed, and multi-screen. So the first thing I have to say is that the new world is not being defined by consolidation, but the only way the old world can compete with these juggernauts, Apple has $250 billion of cash as of June 30. It could write a check for the Walt Disney Company, which is 100 years old, round numbers. So these are really big competitors, and they're not shrinking. They're hitting all-time highs. The market is betting that they win because they are hitting all-time highs. All of my content companies down over the last 6 months. As you know, Disney keeps going down on ESPN fears. Okay, so now let's get to the question at hand. What's going on with the consumer and what's happening with choice? So TV bundle, round numbers, $100 a month, 250 channels, lots of minority channels. Average household watches 18 channels a month, according to Nielsen, stable the last decade. The option value is when AMC suddenly has Duck Dynasty, you turn the channel, you start watching Duck Dynasty, you jettison one of your other 18 channels. Walking Dead on AMC, you turn the channel, you start watching Walking Dead. Consumers suddenly said, I'm not watching all these channels, why am I paying $100? Lots of choices coming to consumers. There's my end. Okay, so lots of choices coming to consumers. Well, so we'll try to turn that off. And so we have YouTube doing 40 channels for $35, Hulu doing 50 channels for $40, DirecTV $35 for 60 channels. Those are all called skinny bundles. Sling TV was the original $20 for 30 channels. But we now have a la carte, more and more, right? The big controversy, the thing that hurt Disney stock last week, is they announced they're going to bring ESPN directly to you. We think he's going to price it at $20 or $30. In the bundle, he's getting $8 times 90 million homes. The important point here is that the TV bundle has gone from 100 million homes to 90. Nielsen says 86, but ESPN insists it's getting paid for 90, so let's use 90 since someone's paying them $8 a month, presumably not for free, right? So let's assume 90 is the right number. So the TV bundle's gone down by 10 million, but Netflix has 50 million US subs. So wait a minute, Netflix is additive, not really a cord cutter, presumably. Yeah, Hulu, we have HBO Now, we have CBS All Access, and let's be clear, CBS is free in the home with rabbit ears, and yet 2 million people are paying $6 a month. Why? Because they want it on this screen, in all the homes and out of home. So the world's moving to mobile devices, and this has value. Even if you can get it free in the home, not enough, 2 million people are gonna pay $6 to take their CBS with them. And so we're going to get more and more a la carte choices. We're getting more and more skinny bundle choices. And it's going to turn out, I believe, that the TV ecosystem, that 90, is going to stabilize at, 80 million homes or 70 million homes and not be zero. Because you know what? None of these skinny bundles have the military channel. None of them have the history channel. None of them have passion channels. And the minute you have 2 or 3 passion channels that you can't get for $40 a month, and by the way, you're gonna add Netflix, and by the way, you're gonna add Hulu, so you're gonna end up saving like $20, you're gonna say, no, I'm gonna pay the $100 and get my passion channels that I'm madly in love with that no one else wants.
So, as our stock market expert, some people suggest that when stock market valuations are high, that's conducive to more mergers. Is there any truth to that?
Well, if they're swapping equity, my view is that the Discovery Scripps is defensive. I would argue, actually, the consolidation in the old world is defensive because they're looking up at the cash hoards of these juggernauts that have been created by men in their lifetime, and they know they cannot compete with them unless they're bigger. So I would say they're defensive.
Thanks. So our next speaker is Dina Kallay from Ericsson. She is the head of competition and IP issues at Ericsson. Obviously, mergers are going to be scrutinized for their antitrust implications by the antitrust agencies. So the question is, what are they going to be looking at, and what should they be looking at? And Dina is going to give us a look at some of the trends in mergers recently, and start to answer that question. Do we have a clicker here?
How do I click? Or can I get the next slide from you guys? I don't know.
Try it, hit the green.
All right, let's go. Oh, yeah, here we go. Oh, wait. Perfect. Gosh, I was hoping I won't go after Laura because I'm going to be boring girl now. But it's a tough act to follow. So I'm the antitrust girl, so I can't match such exciting information. But I thought I'd share with you some data about reportable mergers that get reported to the antitrust agency. So I pulled this information from the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act annual reports that FTC and DOJ put out every year. So I thought you'd find it interesting to see that in the past year, there have been about 1,800 reportable deals to the agencies. And we've seen a gradual increase since the economic crisis of 2009. But if you compare it to the numbers before, you don't see any huge jump. In fact, if you go to the previous decade, from 1996 to 2005, you see that towards the late 90s, we had the number of reported deals was about 2.5 times larger than it is today. For the last year that we have data, 2015, it's 1,800. And in the late 1990s, we had close to 5,000 deals a year. And these are all deals that were reportable, which means that they were above the threshold of the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. So these are the big deals only. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see just the trends of how many deals get reported. This pie chart just shows us how many of these deals were related to information technology. And you see that, the light purple on the left. So it's 9.5% of the reported deals. And it's interesting, I looked back to some data from, for example, 10 years ago, thinking it would be much less because we think information technology is growing. But the number 10 years ago was 8 point something. So it seems to be steady. And I think to this crowd, it seems that this is the whole world. But really, if you look at all of the deals reported, it's just less than 10%. This table summarizes how many of the transactions that were reported went into what we call a second request, which means that the agencies were interested in more information and got into the depth of the deal. And you can see the numbers where it says FTC and DOJ in percentages towards the bottom of the slide. And the numbers are generally between 1% and 2% for each of the agencies. So that means that between 1% and 2% of reported deals get pulled in for more information. But about 90% of these that went into second request, there was some remedy at the end, so the agencies did get involved. Again, I just to look what happened before, I went to the previous decade, and the numbers are very similar. So these numbers are FTC and DOJ together. So it's 1% to 2% for each agencies. Together, it's 2% to 4% a year, and you see that from 1996 to 2005, it was roughly 2% to 4%. So if we can learn anything from the past, I think we haven't seen a big difference in terms of different administrations' intervention or interference with merger activity. This is just the most recent year numbers. So in 2015, 42 cases were challenged. And that's about 90% of cases, as I said, that went into a second request. Below, I looked at the averages for the past decade and for the decade before. It's interesting. It seems that you're slightly more at risk if your deal ends up at the DOJ. You can see, 1.68% compared to 1.54 in the past decades, and there's a little bit more of a difference before. And this is a summary of all the years and all the cases. So that's where we are from the perspective of antitrust agencies. So I don't think you should expect any big changes on how they look at these at deals, and I think statistically they have interfered in a very, very small percentage of cases. And that's true, by the way, of other OECD countries, other developed countries, because antitrust is now global. At least OECD numbers speak of less than 2% of mergers being scrutinized more heavily and potentially getting to a remedy. So I think I'll stop here. I put on the slide a few trends we see in merger review, and I'm happy to talk about them later as part of our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina. Our cleanup hitter is Roger Noll, who's a professor emeritus of economics at Stanford and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And he is, I think, going to talk about why we should care about all of this.
First of all, I want to put all your minds at ease. I'm not out to destroy Duck Dynasty.
They did it themselves.
I think the concept about the caps is a useful starting place because it basically, the right way I think to take that information is to say, what should the government's policy be if we are observing a world in which we are going to have the same total GDP, but the market caps of the major players, the number of players that have market caps that are in the range of the Google, Apple, Microsoft, it goes up by a factor of 10. That is to say, we have extremely large, highly valued companies accounting for a substantially larger share of GDP. And so just putting that by itself doesn't answer the question about what policy should be in response to that unless we address a couple of other questions. And Michael hit the nail right on the head, which is that what's really at issue here is how do people get there, not whether they got there by merger and acquisition or just internal growth, but it's how they got there and what the mechanism was and what the performance indicators are. Did they find a way to get more market power and have higher price-cost margins? Did they get there because there was an efficiency gain? So nothing really happened to prices, but they now have bigger margins simply because they have much lower costs. There were efficiency gains that could not be captured by smaller firms. Or is it none of the above? And if so, then why did they do it? Why are they there? Why are they so big? Those are the questions. And now, traditionally, merger policy in the US has been driven by only one concern, which is, was there in fact incremental market power? And economists have broken a lot of pencils over the last 75 years, developing an incredibly elaborate, both theoretical and empirical methodology for trying to forecast merger outcomes. And we're pretty good at that. Not perfect, of course, because there's too much unknown. But the bottom line to it is what empirical research on this merger and acquisition process essentially comes to the following conclusion, which is, on average, in the long run, most mergers do nothing. They neither improve efficiency nor do they increase market power. They make market caps go up, but it's just purely the additive effect. Take two firms worth $100 billion each and put them together, you have a new firm worth $200 billion, and nothing much has happened. Now that's sort of intriguing by itself because it does ask the magic question, why do people do this? And the same could be said but simply for why do they keep reinvesting in new lines of business so the company itself can grow internally and go from the 100 billion to the 200 billion cap with no change in its on its profits as a fraction of sales or return on investment. And it's at this level that we really don't have anything comparable to the theoretical and empirical base we have regarding predicting effective mergers, because we know there are things out there that may cause problems, but that whether in a specific case of organic growth or merger and acquisition, and we can identify it after the fact, but it's hard to predict it in advance. And I just want to mention, I don't have anywhere near enough time to talk about these. Let's just take a few examples, right? The first is one of the implications of the market cap story is the cash-rich firm versus the cash-poor firm. The firm that, if we think about the software industry in particular, the life cycle of a firm is spend a lot of money up front, and then when you finally get there and you have the thing that's passed the market test, it's almost all gravy. That is to say, the operating costs of continuing to update and continuing to improve and all that are trivial compared to the amount of revenue coming in. Profit margins are astronomical. They can be 90%. And this means you're going to pay a lot of tax. So unless you can figure out a way to offshore it. And if you pay a lot of tax, that's a bad thing. So you might want to acquire other companies in the early phase so that between the two of you, you could avoid tax. And it turns out that's been fairly well documented as an explanation for a lot of acquisitions by, say, mid-level of maturity firms in the IT sector acquiring younger firms. Another one had to do with something Michael only mentioned, which is the politics of policy, which to me strikes I think Michael here is really on to something that's terribly important that we know almost nothing about. And that's just, here's what we do know. If you employ 10,000 people in a congressional district, or you have annual sales of $5 billion, that congressman is going to pay attention to you. Doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative, that guy's going to pay attention to you. Moreover, politicians at the state level, at the local level, and at the congressional level are going to fall all over you to build a plant in their district. All right? And why? Because that substantially increases the demand for your services as a politician to provide favors to that firm. Now, if a firm grows and grows and grows and has more and more congressional districts that satisfy this fundamental criteria of being too big to ignore, too big to fail is a subset of too big to ignore, then you can have a world in which you may have something that looks structurally competitive, 5 or 6 firms. So we, as an HHI lover, predicting about competition, would say, oh, that's structurally competitive, nothing to worry about. But they can succeed in getting the government to retard the rate of innovation and entry by potential competitors. And we have zero evidence about how to forecast in advance whether any given consolidation is going to cause that effect. And that's because there hasn't developed on the political side the same kind of algorithmic research to predict these things as has happened on the HHA side. Well, I have a number of these examples. You will have to wait until the movie. But, you know, I just give you one example. Jeff Bezos did not buy the Washington Post because he thought it was going to increase his market power or reduce the costs of Amazon. We have pyramid building. We have people acquiring firms and getting into markets because they want to build monuments to themselves. And they're willing to sacrifice some efficiency to do that. So, can we predict when a merger or acquisition or entry into a new field is pyramid building that will actually may even have efficiency costs? No. But it's there, and we have examples.
Thank you, Roger. Well, there's lots of different things to discuss. Let me just kind of go back to, well, Dina suggested, based on the historical record, that we're not going to see much of a change in merger policy. Michael, in his remarks, I think was alluding to a kind of a school of thought that's gotten more and more prominent lately in this area, suggesting several things. One is that there is a growing concentration problem, and actually, I'd like, if people talk about that, maybe they can talk a little bit about what the relationship is between concentration and competitiveness. But there's a growing concentration problem. There's a concern about vertical combinations and foreclosure. There's a general concern that some companies are too big. But probably the most concrete policy recommendation that comes out of that, the people who are writing this stuff, is that merger policy is too lax and has been too lax. Too many mergers that shouldn't have gotten through, get through, and even that we should change our merger policies so that at least for large mergers, the burden of proof should be on the merging parties rather than on the government to show that it's somehow anti-competitive. Any of you all want to comment on
Michael, you've done it. You've done it.
Michael could probably recite the literature better than I, but just a brief story. It's a very contested issue in economics as to what the right answer to that question is. On the one hand, there are people who say that a significant fraction of mergers lead to higher profit margins on the price side rather than the efficiency side, but a very large fraction lead to nothing. That's the first empirical result. And the second empirical result is that the long-run effect, as opposed to the short, I was just repeating the short-run effect, that the long-run effect is that the conditions, mergers that are made with conditions by FTC or DOJ, perform no better and no worse than mergers that are made without conditions.
Go back. Oh, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Good. Go ahead.
Well, just on your last point, I was going to say that the FTC did a report recently, right? They revisited merger cases where they did take action, and they wanted to check whether that made a difference and made things better. And I think they overwhelmingly found that it was helpful that they
We
did.
found that they'd done a really good job.
It was an empirical report.
Yeah. Could I, in addressing Roger's, I think the observation on merger, I think the history of merger, if you go back far enough, is that it's even worse than Roger suggests. It isn't that these mergers are not efficiency enhancing. It's that they are probably misguided in the first place. I mean, you go back to the 1960s and 70s when we had all these conglomerate mergers. I mean, I can remember when Gulf and Western Industries, which I think had South Puerto Rican sugar, some non-ferrous castings manufacturing, and then bought Paramount Pictures. And I can remember meeting with the chairman of this company and over that issue of whether the network should be able to get in the motion picture business and so forth. And he couldn't answer any question about the motion picture industry. I mean, finally, obviously, Gulf and Western Industries had to disband or just have a dispersal sale, selling off most of those acquisitions because these mergers made no sense. There's an awful lot of spinning off of unsuccessful mergers. So I think it's even worse than Roger suggested.
Well, so I mean, as Roger was suggesting before, do they make sense from a tax avoidance?
The point Bob's making, the reason the issue is contested, that's what the word I used was contested, is that you can find horror stories and you can also find examples that are great. And the issue is what on average is true 10 years later. And on average, what's true 10 years later is nothing. But that statement is contested, like the FTC believes it's doing a great job. But not everybody agrees with the FTC's assessment of its own performance. So and that's contested. It's not that they're wrong and the people who criticize them are right. It's just that we don't know enough to be able to say for certain, on balance, that they do better or worse than throwing darts at the dartboard.
I guess the point I would add is, The point I would add is on Disney. So sometimes the acquire, it depends on what you acquired. So Bob Iger inherited a broken content engine, and he went out and he purchased Pixar, Lucasfilms, and Marvel, and they've had an unprecedented run of hits that I haven't seen in 30 years of covering film. So he looks like a genius on all three counts. Every single internet company he's bought, he's written off 100% within 5 years, and he just bought BAM, all of it. So it is my view that they will end up writing off all of BAM. Why? You can't keep the employees. There is no tech employee that wants to work for the Walt Disney Company where their shares go up 5% a year, or are going down right now, versus working at BAM with those kinds of time frames, with those kinds of smart people. So sometimes, even if you let the same company buy different types of companies, some of them they write off, and some of them they can make work because of their cultural fit. So I would say that's a difference, too, that public policy has nothing to do with. It just has to do with, well, who wants to work for the company that was the acquirer.
On this question of public policy, talk about the implications. Roger is saying that lots of these things end up, the merger is a big nothing, and I think there's lots of reasons to believe that is a correct finding. But I think the implication for policy is, in some sense, is also a big nothing, which is, if people in the private sector want to make mistakes, we should let them make mistakes. And I don't think we want to try to use, and I know you're not suggesting this, we don't want to start to use competition policy to start protecting shareholders because we think management is destroying value by going through all the expenses of doing these things. I mean, it is an important part of the success of the U.S. that we decentralize the decision making and then we let companies try these things even if we think a lot of times it doesn't work out.
So to switch subject, let me ask one more question, then I'll go to the audience. To switch subjects a little bit to the wireless sector, the three biggest bidders in the recent spectrum auction were T-Mobile and Dish, which has a lot of unused spectrum, and Comcast, and all of them have been subject to speculation at one point or another about possible mergers. So, I mean, what role, if any, does the spectrum play in potential combinations that might be on the horizon?
Okay, let me. This is actually related to the previous two panels. The big spectrum issue for the future has to do with the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence. By 2025, probably 90 to 95% of the use of the Internet is going to be machine-to-machine communications in which no human being is involved. And so the issue about how to optimize the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence use, the development of algorithms to run things that don't require any kind of human intervention, just like driverless cars all need to talk to each other. That helps them not hit each other, and so that's how the FCC decides to let that happen in 5G standards for wireless and all which is the crucial fact for what I've just described. When broadband becomes as cheap over wireless as it is now over cable television systems, then the world is going to be very, very different in ways that are almost impossible to predict. And that's an incredibly difficult policy problem. I mean, trying to predict what the Internet of Things is going to do to the structure of industry and how it's going to be dependent on the wireless allocation rules is the great challenge of our time. And it's not one that's easily solved by getting some lawyers together in a regulatory agency or some sort of negotiation and dividing up the babies among the current players who are not the ones who are going to be important in this new space.
To tie your question to specifically to mergers, though, it depends. I think it's really not about the spectrum in the sense that if you had a company that's just sitting on a lot of spectrum and they're not using it, that's not a good, even if you want spectrum, that's not a reason to buy the company. You should buy the spectrum from them. So where it becomes interesting and starts driving mergers is where, and you might think this is what's going on with Comcast, is they want the spectrum, right, they're getting spectrum because they then also want to get in the wireless industry, and they may want to get a partner to do that, but it's not because they're doing that as a standalone business, it's because they're thinking about what that would have to do with the whole bundle they're offering. And so it comes back to something I was saying at the very beginning, somewhat cryptically, that it's really about combining complementary assets. So I think in all of these mergers, you're going to start thinking about that, is you're going to ask, well, what is it that the two parties bring to it that they can't just trade at arm's length? And again, if somebody's just sitting on spectrum and they're not using it all for their own purposes, that's clearly something you can trade at arm's length. So that wouldn't justify the merger by itself. There's got to be something else rolled into it.
Let me open it up to the audience. There must be some questions on this. Right over here. If you could identify, Maureen and then Jim.
Thanks. So I had a question for the panel. Tom, you mentioned a lot of articles kind of talking about problems with consolidation happening and that somehow this is creating anti-competitive or problematic conditions. And I took a look at these. I have an article on this. And a lot of them seem to focus on things that we wouldn't define as an antitrust market. Right, so a hospital in California doesn't compete with a hospital in Pennsylvania, even if the same hospital system might own one or the other. A lot of these markets are local. So I'd be curious to see if any folks in the panel had a reaction to some of these complaints about consolidation writ large. Is there something we're missing by just looking at a traditional antitrust market? Then secondly, I just wanted to have a clarification. The study we did was a remedies study, right? So we looked at divestitures and asked, did they preserve competition that we wanted to preserve through the divestiture? Not whether, did we challenge the right universe of mergers? So I think...
So
No, I just wanted to be
Yeah,
clear for the
yeah.
audience. They may not have understood that. So anyway, just curious about the consolidation concerns.
That's actually supposed to be my domain. That's what I was supposed to be talking about. I think, Maureen, you're absolutely right. This is not a traditional antitrust concern. This is something bigger than that that has something to do with too big to fail and something to do with coordination across policies, like implementation of the provisions in the Affordable Care Act about cooperation within healthcare regions among various types of providers. Those could flip into being airline regulation of the 1960s, right? So there is a competition policy concern about it, but it's not one that's captured by Herfindahl indexes in relevant markets. It's much more of, is this the camel's nose into a world in which the government gets into the business of protecting the healthcare sector from competition?
Just on this, and I don't know the specifics of the healthcare example, but there are ways, at least, that people have tried to squeeze these things into a more traditional framework. And again, thinking of Comcast, Time Warner Cable, even though they're in different geographic markets, people then argued, and I guess the government took the position that, well, that may be true in the viewing, in terms of viewing and subscription markets, but when you look at the input markets, that should be thought of as more of a national, and then it's a little odd why it's a national and not an international market, but sort of Goldilocks works aside, by saying that there was a national market for that. And it may be someone saying the same thing, I don't know, with the hospitals saying, well, what does that mean for dealing with insurers? But I think that then gets into another set of issues that I think antitrust has dealt with for years, but somehow is coming to the fore, and that is how we understand changes in bargaining positions and what it means for input prices. Back when I was at the DOJ, the joke, unfortunately the joke and the reality were, well, when it comes to monopsony, there's no such thing unless it's against doctors and farmers, and then we enforce it, because we worry about it, but otherwise we're not going to worry about monopsony. And it sort of went along like that, and now I think people are starting to raise a lot of questions on is there too much power of the buyers? And I think it's somewhere where we really need to update our learning. So for example, and one example from cable industry, the usual problem with monopoly is it's the flip side of, monopsony, the flip side of monopoly, which is in the textbook, and I've written the textbook that says this, the textbook version of monopsony says you suppress the amount you buy in order to drive the price down. But in a lot of industries with bargaining, the way it works is you bargain over the price, and then the buyer gets to buy as much at that price as they want. So what the buyer does, is if they have enough power, is they bargain to get a low price, and then since they bargain for a low price, they buy more of the input, not less. So it works exactly the opposite direction, right? Instead of having your buyer power lead you to buy less, your buyer power leads you to buy more. And I think that hasn't fully been incorporated into antitrust, and it's something we're struggling with. And also, I think we struggle with it because people aren't quite sure what to make of it. Should we be protecting the sellers and saying they're entitled to benefits of competition too? Or are we really, when we say consumers, do we mean it sort of more literally than I think a lot of economists mean it, which is we really mean the more like households and the downstream user?
Well, I think Maureen was actually, if I'm not wrong, referring to these studies which take broad, kind of SIC code categories of,
Yeah, like The Economist,
and there's been slight increases in concentration over a period. But anyway,
Yeah, I
think
wanted
Bob
to add
wanted to say, Dina wanted to say something.
I just wanted to respond to Michael's point about Comcast Time Warner. Shortly thereafter, some considerable period thereafter, then Time Warner and Charter merged. Now that was not 1 and 2, but 2 and 3. Did that make the difference? Or was it that the concern of monopsony power has been eroded by the development of streaming in the interim?
Well, the odd thing I want to disclose, I worked for Charter on Charter Time Warner Cable, and for my particular part was to say, if you let them merge, they're going to pay lower prices to get content. And so you could imagine in some worlds the government would have said that's a bad thing and that's anti-competitive. And fortunately for my clients, the government, which I think correctly in this case, said, no, that's a good thing. But again, it's this thing I think we struggle with, is if it's going to drive prices
Yeah,
down.
well,
is
and that was
good or bad?
John Malone has been behind the drive for consolidation in cable for just that reason. But what I'm asking is, has the development of streaming made that much less likely?
Right, that you would be able to get the lower prices.
That you have less bargaining power because the content provider can bypass you by going directly through the internet.
Excellent. Interesting question, but we're
All right.
running
Okay.
out
I'll be
of
quick,
time.
yeah.
So let Dina, and maybe, do we have time for one more question after that or not? So Dina, and then.
I would just add that the things that fall out of traditional antitrust analysis, I would make a plea for the antitrust agencies to stay out of it for many reasons, but I'll mention two. One is that this business is becoming global, so there are antitrust agencies all over the world which would love to spread into things that have nothing to do with antitrust analysis. They're already doing it, and this will give them legitimacy to promote industrial policy issues that have nothing to do with competition. And the second one is, I think, towards the end of the previous administration, we saw some of the agencies do that, and we now face the results, and they're anti-competitive. So I think antitrust agencies should stay in their mandate.
Can I just make one comment on Facebook? If you try to limit these people's acquisitions, they'll just do it themselves. So you may recall that they tried to buy Snap in 2013. They didn't. And now they just handed it to Instagram and said, go copy that because it's working. And it took 6 months for the smartest people on earth to replicate exactly what Evan had done over at Snap. So if you don't let them buy it and give money to shareholders, rightly or wrongly, they will just go do it themselves. They can build it themselves, buy or build. So it's faster for them to market to buy it, but if you don't let them, they can build it.
Okay, we could go on, but thanks a lot. It was a great discussion.